folks.
Yep. Hey, Carl, how are you?
Good. How's everyone doing?
Just fine. We have actually got quite an audience today, so we're going to go ahead and get started so we can
Okay.
keep everyone and all of that. So, I would like to thank everyone for coming out today, both online and in person. Just to let everyone know that our next History for Lunch will be September the 20th at 12 on the topic of early coastal North Carolina Quakers and slavery. Quakers from Virginia and New England arrived in coastal North Carolina from the 1650s into the early 1700s. Surprisingly, many were enslavers who forced enslaved people to labor on Quaker farms in the colony. J. Timothy Allen, PhD, professor of humanities at Strayer University, will discuss the early North Carolina Quakers' attitudes toward slavery and how and why they progressed from slavery to manunism. Okay, and then before we get started today, we would like to let everyone know that Friday evening we will take Moonshine and Motorsports racing to Dixieland Speedway. They will have a very special night because they will have additional features that evening, and they will also have the juice box racer. So if any of you remember the big wheels that we grew up with, where you could pedal and pull the brake on the side and do the 360s, well, the children are racing in these type of battery operated juice box racers, and we will highlight them with a special gift for each one that participates on Friday evening. The gates open at 5 and we have feature racing at 8 p.m. So you're invited to come out that evening to Dixieland Speedway. But today we welcome Carl Galloway. He is the digital marketing manager for the Moonshine and Motorsports Trail, and he's going to provide us a more in-depth look into the development of the trail, recognizing the rich history and highlighting each of the 8 sites home to a marker. So, Carl, thank you very much for joining us, and I'm going to turn it over to you.
My name, as Lori mentioned, and thank you, Lori, and the museum for having me today, is Carl Galloway. I work at the Department of Natural and Cultural Resources, which is a state entity that's over state parks, museums, and a lot of other things. One of our big projects over the past year and a half, I suppose, has been, or almost 2 years, has been the Moonshine and Motorsports Cultural Trail. And that has involved a lot of different things. I'm here today to talk a little bit about what is a cultural trail, why do we have them, and what we're doing with this particular one. So the why, the trail itself started with a note in the 2023 budget, the 2021 budget, and that was a directive to create a cultural trail surrounding the story of Moonshine and Motorsports. And that's more or less where we started. We didn't have much more to go on from then that, and we built out from there what that means. And so when we did start, we got our feet wet in a bunch of different places. We took trips out to the Albemarle Peninsula, to North Wilkesboro, 2 of the areas that are located on the trail. But the reason for the trail itself, as we started to build out logic around it and connections, was to talk about this huge history that we have here of distilling and stock car racing, which I think a lot of North Carolinians know about, but not a lot of people necessarily outside of the state know about it. And there's a lot of spaces inside the state that have this history or share this history that aren't connected or aren't talking or aren't in one place altogether. And in the Department of Cultural Resources, it's our job to lift up these stories and present them both to North Carolinians and then to folks outside of the state and help people make sense of why different histories matter, and why different histories have the impact that they do. Specific goals with this trail were to drive tourism, particularly in smaller rural economies, overall to provide context to distilling and to stock car racing in North Carolina. And you can see here on the trail map that we have, these are our first 8 locations, Museum of the Albemarle being one of them. Let's move on to the next slide here. So to give a little bit of context about cultural trails in general, they're interesting. You know, it's the year of the trail, and North Carolina has an abundance of natural trails. You know, we feature the Mountain to Sea Trail among many others, Ponte Flora. And I think the idea of a natural trail is relatively easily grasped by folks. You can walk on it, you can explore it, you can examine nature and interact with the natural surroundings in the space. Cultural trail is slightly different. We have a few examples here in the state, or in North Carolina, the Blue Ridge Music Trails, the African American Heritage Music Trails, among others. They feature locations and sites that are important to whatever history they are discussing. The way you can interact with these trails is to visit these different locations. Driving is a really good way to do that. But essentially to be able to look at a map or a region and say, this history happened in this space, and these are the places that helped build that history. It helps us understand a little bit more about the state that we're in and about what happened here before us and what's continuing to happen here. That's a cultural trail. And the Moonshine and Motorsports is one of those. It's our newest. Okay, brief history, little history lesson. For those of us who aren't aware of Prohibition. North Carolina actually experienced Prohibition about 12 years before the rest of the state. We had over 500 family-owned distilleries here. There was a lot of different kinds of liquor that were being created and distilled. Among them were bourbon. We have a longer history of producing bourbon here in Kentucky, or then in Kentucky, which is one of the reasons too that it's important for us to talk about this story. You know, we as the department give historical context to this history, into distilling, into the practice of distilling. In the sense, and then the North Carolinians have that history to access, to use, and to say, look how important and how long this history is here that we have in this state. This is you know, a news clipping, and then also a picture of a moonshine bust a little later on down the line, which characterized a lot of communities throughout the state of North Carolina, all over the place. Of course, this is where the story of Moonshine and Motorsports begins. What followed? Folks turned to distilling in North Carolina because North Carolina had an abundance of clean water, railroads for transporting things, and of grain. It had the key elements needed to produce liquor. When Prohibition happened, folks either went underground or they went to places where Prohibition had not yet been enacted, like Kentucky, for example, that had similar conditions. Folks
Carl, can
then,
I interrupt for
yeah,
just a moment? Your
sure.
slides are not showing.
Oh, that's, uh-oh. Sorry about that. Let me go back to the beginning here and see what's going on. What could it be? What could it be? It says that it's showing on my end. This would be a lot more interesting presentation, I think, with some pictures to look at. Let's see. I'm not entirely sure, Lori. Let me see here. Presenter view and section. Is that helpful?
We're still not seeing any slides.
Let me try to just share my screen and see if that works. I thought maybe it would go through Zoom, but let's see if this lets me do it. How are we looking?
There we go. We're good now.
I'm sorry about that, y'all. I apologize. Let me go through this again. How are we looking? Good.
Yes. So we have your title slide.
Title slide. Great. We're on the same page then.
Okay. Awesome. Thank you.
Yes, of course. I'm sorry about that. But why? Cultural trails matter. We want to highlight rural areas and economies across the state. Here's the trail map. You can take a look at it and see we worked hard to try and be intentional about distributing geographically across the state as much as we could. This is a story that touches all parts of the state. Trails, cultural trails. We have a lot of them here in North Carolina. Cultural trails are ways to explore history in a space and also stories. And the Moonshine and Motorsports is one of the latest. Prohibition. This is why it all began. North Carolina was a a great space for distilling, and folks used that as a way to supplement income and as a way to increase the value of any crops that they might have by converting corn, for example, into liquor. When Prohibition happened in North Carolina, folks went underground in the state, or they went to other states. And to get the liquor around, they began to turn to using stock cars to transport untaxed liquor, which is moonshine. And there are moonshiners who create the moonshine and bootleggers who deliver the moonshine. Sometimes they are the same person, but not all the time necessarily. This is an example of some of the spaces that this history manifested in. On the far left, you can see Spot White Garage in Asheville, North Carolina, which was a kind of an infamous place for bootleggers to get their cars worked on. I'm from Asheville, and I'm trying to figure out where that was. I think it might be on South Slope, where there's a bunch of breweries today, probably. But I need to go up there and try and trace the tracks. Junior Johnson, moving to the right, famous moonshiner and then driver from North Wilkesboro. An example of a stock car in Raleigh, a former stock car that supposedly was used to transport liquor. And then all the way on the right, you start to see how this practice manifests as sport and as competition. It was always the bootleggers who had the money to put on or to support racers, for example. And so this the tracks and the competition was very much intertwined with the folks who made the liquor. That's how we have stock car racing, and then ultimately that manifests, of course, as NASCAR. Out east, y'all, I'm sure are familiar with this, so I'm looking forward to questions or perhaps corrections of any histories here, but these are some examples of what was happening out east. It was timber, largely, and then a lot of the timber industries turned towards distilling to supplement, and then ultimately to just fully commit to distilling as an industry and as a way of life. Bottom left, you see some timber workers. Above that, you see federal agents who have made a raid, and the large copper worm that they're displaying kind of indicates the volume of liquor that was being produced. Something I've heard over the past year or so is that while Western North Carolina certainly has, and Wilkes County has the largest amount of fame surrounding distilling and moonshining, people think of it as a very Appalachian practice, which it is. The volume in the east was much greater. The trail. So we wanted to take a look at this history, which is gigantic and broad, and a year is not nearly enough time to wrap our heads around it completely, but it's just the beginning. And so in doing so, we looked through the state and identified locations that held this history in ways that folks knew about. North Wilkesboro, of course, the speedway there, which was home to Junior Johnson and a lot of other racers, and had closed in, I think, the late 80s. That was a mecca for race car drivers. And anytime that those drivers left the state, they always took a little bit of moonshine with them. This is according to some of the folks that we've spoken with there. And that's part of the way that Wilkes County gained its fame as the moonshine capital of North Carolina, and in some cases, the moonshine capital of the world. An interesting story, we've heard stories about folks who got their sugar for the moonshine Distilling requires sugar, basically, and you can get that sugar from a lot of different places. You can get it from corn, potatoes. You create a mash with whatever it is that you're using, and then you distill that mash to extract the alcohol. That's sort of the basic approach to distilling. And some of the folks who distilled in Wilkes County got their sugar from Cuba, a practice that ended after the Cuban Missile Crisis, actually. So it continued on. Above that, you can see the picture of an old still. That's in Stone Mountain. It's pretty close to North Wilkesboro. And that's just an example of one of the sites in the hollers where folks distilled in the mountains. They do offer, Stone Mountain does offer tours going up to these trails. Some trail folks, Bob Hillier among them, have identified different locations. And if you're interested in exploring where the stills are, you can call the ranger office at Stone Mountain and try to arrange a way to see those stills. Rockingham Speedway and Okanichi Speedway are two locations on the trail as well. Okanichi used to be a horse track a long time ago, and I believe it was Bill France who identified it from a plane, saying that would be a pretty good short track. Both of these are examples of NASCAR short tracks that were an alternative to the super speedways and are a slightly more rural approach. Okanichi, I think that Richard Petty won the last two races there. Louis Smith raced there, among others. And the Rock is another example of a racetrack, a rural racetrack that is important to its community, and that has hopes, like North Wilkesboro, to be reopened. North Wilkesboro reopened using federal money. It was COVID relief money, and it's been a real success there. And the communities around Rockingham are also excited about that too, that potential focus and light getting shined on that space. NASCAR Hall of Fame, of course. We want to focus on this place as a repository for the history and a focus for the history as it stands. Our approach to this has been really focusing on the connection between Moonshine and Motorsports. Leading up to that, of course, we discussed NASCAR, and of course, we discussed the huge business that has come out of it, which has a lot of the reason why this has garnered so much support. But we do also want to focus on the broader history that brought us here, and then the smaller places too that haven't had the light shined on them as much. Albemarle Peninsula, you can see on the right an image of a timber barge and a tugboat, which would have been very typical, a typical site on the peninsula and in that area, in y'all's area, well, about 100 years ago, I suppose. Those are two locations on the trail. The focus of the Albemarle Peninsula, of course, is the Museum of Albemarle, where we direct folks to understand this history of the region. Charlotte Motor Speedway was one of the first huge speedways, was the first huge speedway, and it they faced a lot of trouble in that space, between the large amount of granite that they had to remove from the racetrack site before building, and bankruptcy, and ultimately managed to get it rolling. And was one of the locations that really gave North Carolina international fame in terms of what it offered for racers. Some of the faces that make up moonshining and distilling. We're working hard to tell stories that are a little lesser known. On the right, you'll see Popcorn Sutton, probably the most famous moonshiner in North Carolina, from the Maggie Valley area. There's a few documentaries about him and his work and his run-ins with the law. And it was, not an easy life. Another thing too that we're focusing on with this trail is discussing the really illicit nature, the tough nature of this job. And it's easy to romanticize these stories and these narratives. And it's also important to remember how rough it was. Alvin Sawyer in the center, king of the moonshiners, in the Albemarle Peninsula, demonstrating his homemade his homemade still. And then on the left is Howard Creech, who was basically right-hand man to Percy Flowers in Johnson County, famous moonshiner and master distiller, took on a lot of the work that made the Flowers name and made the Flowers empire. This is a pretty, not a typical story, but it's a story that's been repeated. Jack Daniels, their master distiller, at the outset of that industry, was Nearest Green. He was a black man, I believe, formerly enslaved, who provided the know-how that gave Jack Daniels its start. African American folks and indigenous people were involved in distilling before Prohibition. Pardon me, I can't remember the name of the act, but there was an act that outlawed people of color to practice distilling. And so it was necessary for those groups and communities to go underground with that practice before the broader white population had to. It's more difficult to find these stories due to the fact that those communities faced underrepresentation or oppression in ways that white communities didn't necessarily, although the range of experiences is very diverse. So we're working hard to try and draw out stories from indigenous populations and African American communities on distilling and on those practices. And we're hopeful to bring some more of those into the space next year, hopefully particularly in the Occaneechi population and the Lumbee communities too. We're working on a traveling exhibit right now and getting that content finalized, which we'll be able to share across the state and at the museum. Some of the stories, Wendell Scott, famous race car driver, the first African-American race car driver in NASCAR. He did do some moonshining and some bootlegging from what we understand. He faced a lot of adversity. A lot of race car drivers, it was typical that win or lose, you would at least be given gas money to drive home. He wasn't necessarily always afforded that sort of treatment, and pushed forward. His story, I mean, really deserves a whole exhibit on its own. But Wendell Scott is quite the character. Louis Smith, an early female driver. This is her standing in front of her car that she wrecked at Occaneechi. Again, see, these are some of the stories of racing and of distilling that are a little bit lesser known, and spaces that we want to highlight. The takeaway for what we're working with here, we found that overall, the work that we do with the department is historical. It's also talks about the present as well, but we have found that nostalgia is a really a powerful way to connect with people and with readers and folks who engage with our work through archival pictures, through stories, through oral histories. This is a story, distilling and moonshining in North Carolina, or distilling and stock car racing, that I didn't know much about, to be honest, up until about 2 years ago. And it seems like a big secret that everyone knows. And every time we have an interview, they say, well, yeah, have you heard of that? Or have you heard of this? And we want to really hone in on those memories and of that sense of pride, or just the memories that folks have about these spaces. Rural stories. North Carolina is a very rural state. And as folks are exploring these spaces, either through Main Street towns, or through other road trips, I think it's important, or we think it's important to provide this kind of a context for businesses and for communities in those spaces to use and to highlight, to say this happened here, and this is something that we want to talk about. A pioneer in distilling, North Carolina, early distilling business. We provide the history side of things for people in the distilling industry to point at and say this story matters. Similarly, lending this context to a broad and deep history and trying to act as best we can as a hub for a lot of these stories and to present it all in one place. The initiative and the campaign runs through next year, through 2024. We are in the process of producing our traveling exhibit, which will be at each one of our locations across the state. We are in the process of gathering more imagery, doing research for podcasts and playlists, and putting all that together for y'all to enjoy on the website. So this is going to keep going, and we're really excited about it, to keep building out the story. This is time for questions. Feel free to use this QR code to get yourself to the URL to the website. You know, we're here to listen. And like I said, we're just getting started on this. And thank you, Lori, and everyone at the museum for hosting me. I think you might be muted. I can't hear you, Lori. There we go.
Okay, I just wanted to thank you, but I was also asking if our in-person guests or our virtual guests had any questions for us. No. I guess you covered it all, Carl, because I don't see, but just, yes, I do have a question.
Sure.
Where were local facilities around this area?
I'm sorry.
Where were local facilities located around this area?
So, Carl, we do have the question of where local distilleries were located around this area.
Yeah.
I have Miss Barber in the audience, and do you want me to refer that question to her?
Please. Hi, Chris.
In the Albemarle region, they were basically in swamps and forests. They were plenty in Pasquotank County, Camden County, even in Currituck County, but mostly in Pasquotank and Camden, but also in other areas and south of the Albemarle Sound. But in this area, they were here because of the access to Norfolk, and the markets and bootleggers hauled things in great amounts to Norfolk, Virginia, and then further up the coast. But there were stills in remote areas throughout the region, actually. But there were a lot in this area because of the proximity to the state line.
Okay. Other questions? Yes, sir.
Lori, there was in the presentation, there was a reference to the Albemarle Peninsula. And it's not a term that I'm accustomed to. And just wondering if you or someone can elaborate on that.
So, Carl, they're asking if you can elaborate on the Albemarle Peninsula.
Sure. Well, I think that I'm referring to the space around the Albemarle Sound and the region, and perhaps I'm off in describing it in that sense. What I'm trying to describe is the space that Chris described in terms of the swamp and the proximity to the state line and everything that happened around Elizabeth City. That may be something that we need to address in terms of geographic description, but let me know.
Mr. Barber, would you like to add to that?
It's that section of land south of the Albemarle Sound, north of the Pamlico Sound, and west of the Croatan Sound. It's basically mainland Dare County, Carroll County, Hyde County, Washington County, and a portion of Butler County. It's that peninsula of land that sticks out between the Pamlico Sound and the Albemarle.
Additional, yes, sir.
How integrated was the industry? I think of a moonshiner producing moonshine for local consumption, but it sounds like it was more integrated and larger than that.
Carl, if do you want to add?
Yeah,
Okay.
I can hear that. And I may refer to the barbers who are blessings in their breadth of knowledge and work. But in terms of integrated, the industry, are you referring to sort of like the idea of an individual or just a few moonshiners as opposed to a really large industry? Like in the timber industry, I believe that they used a lot of the infrastructure that the timber industry developed and a lot of the resources to produce liquor on a large scale, leading to East Lake Liquor, which happened in the Buffalo City area. Is that more or less the question?
I'm not sure. I just wondered how well organized and extensive it.
Oh,
would-
sure. Well, in the East, extremely well organized. I think the figure is 1.5 million gallons of liquor a year. Access to a lot of materials like gas boats, as well as supplying cities like Baltimore and Norfolk and New York in a lot of spaces too. So the liquor that was produced in the eastern area of North Carolina really extended, and Chicago really extended to other parts of the country, in a way that smaller operations in the western area of the state did not. So that's something that surprised me, or that I didn't know about, was just the extent of that production. I hope that answers the question.
Thank you.
Yes, ma'am.
When the moonshine was transported, was it in glass jugs or metal containers or both?
Did you hear that, Carl?
I did, yeah, I can hear pretty well. It depends. Often glass, moving closer to modernity or relative modernity. Plastic jugs were used, but I believe it was often glass, and I think that out east they used what are called demijohns, which are like large jugs, essentially glass jugs, and those would be purchased by the railroad car to give you a sense of the quantity that they were producing. I suppose there would be a lot of other ways to move moonshine in terms of barrels or other sort of hidden surreptitious methods, but I'm not entirely sure what those would be. Largely glass, yeah.
Question? Yes, sir.
Did the moonshiners, how did they integrate with the mob? The mob was obviously the final distributor, but there had to be some kind of a link between the people who were producing it and those who were selling at retail.
It's a great question, and I'm not entirely sure I have all the information on that. I often think about that movie Once Upon a Time in America, which takes place in New York, and where they have a huge moonshine operation, and think potentially some of that liquor could have come from North Carolina. But in terms of their direct connection, what I understand, the extent of my understanding, is the production that occurred here and the cities that it went to. How it got handed off, where it got handed off, I'm not entirely positive. Something I can follow up on.
Okay.
Carl, I'll add to that just a little bit.
Thank you.
It is not clear what their connections were, except it was a series of bootleggers. And so you had your local bootlegger who picked up from wherever, and he moved it along. And much of the liquor here went by boat, not all by vehicles, but a lot of it by vehicles. But it was a series of connections. I'm sure that by the time you got to Norfolk, there was an inner city connection that was a much bigger operation than down here. And so as it went up the coast, I presume, I can't swear to it, but I presume that it networked to a number of places that were much larger and better organized. And by the time you got to Baltimore or New York City or any of those places, they had their networks in place.
Any more questions from the audience? Okay, I got another one.
I have a book that will be out in about a month or two, I hope, and it will be called, the title is When Ghosts Made Moonshine, Prohibition in the Albemarle. And it'll focus only on the Prohibition years, 1920 to 1933. And that's some of what's in my book. So I'm not gonna say any more.
Okay. Carl?
I couldn't hear that one. Could you repeat the gist of that for me, Lori?
It was question if the moonshine was better in some regions than the other.
I don't know. I think that, shoot, I don't know. There's all sorts of, like folk knowledge about better water, mountain water versus other things like that. There were different types that was created. Cherry Bounce is very famous from the Rutherford County area. which is just moonshine infused with cherry, but that might come down to folk knowledge and general regional friendly competition.
And we do plan to have Miss Chris Barber here as a guest speaker as soon as she gets her book ready. We will get her on our calendar so that she can give a talk, because it seems like this is a very popular subject matter in our region. Other questions?
Where do you get the good stuff today?
Where do we find the good stuff today? I don't know if anybody will truly admit to that. But I'm not sure about that. But that's a good question.
Is there a moonshine, illicit moonshine industry?
Absolutely not.
I cannot answer that. Okay, so I do recommend that you go to our state-controlled ABC package store for that. Other questions? Awesome. So Carl, thank you very much for joining us today virtually from Raleigh. And we would like to thank our virtual guests and our in-person guests today. Like I said, Carl, this is one of the larger groups we have had in a couple of months. So we are delighted. And again, we do invite you to come up to Dixieland Speedway on Friday evening. The gates open at 5 and racing will begin around 8 or 8:30. And you can catch the little juice boxers. They're all 5 and under, and so hopefully they will be our future race car drivers. And hopefully we'll have some coming out of the juice box racers. Again, thank you very much for joining us.
Thanks, everyone. Please reach out with any questions, and thank y'all at the museum for hosting.
Thank you. Thank you, Carl.
Thanks. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.